Throughout history, imaginations has led the way, long before science could catch up. Writers, artists, and dreamers pictured machines and technologies long before they were possible. And here's the astonishing part: many of those visions eventually came true. In this first part, we'll explore three extraordinary minds who imagined the future before anyone else dared. And we begin with a man who may have been the greatest dreamer of them all, Leonardo da Vinci. Centuries before the Wright brothers, the dream of flight was already in the air. In China, children played with a bamboo toy called Zhu Ping, also known as the bamboo dragonfly. It was just a toy, but it hinted at something bigger. Objects could rise into the sky. Centuries later, another mind would dream of making that idea real: Leonardo da Vinci. When you hear his name, you probably think of Mona Lisa or The Last Supper, but in his notebooks was something very different. A sketch of a flying machine almost 400 years before humans would leave the ground. Da Vinci called it the aerial screw. You can picture a giant corkscrew of linen spun by men running in circles. The spiral, he thought, would bite into the air and lift upward. But in the late 1400s, Europe was still in the age of knights and castles. Human flight wasn't just difficult, it was unimaginable. But how did Leonardo know to even try? How could someone surrounded by castles and swords imagine a machine that would rise into the sky? Da Vinci was obsessed with nature. He studied the flight of birds and the flow of water to the anatomy of plants, believing nature's design held the key to understanding the world and solving human problems. He didn't have the materials or engines to make it real, but what's remarkable is that Leonardo dared to imagine vertical flight at all. He wasn't just an artist, he was sketching the future. The dream lingered. Humans didn't take off until 1903, when the Wright brothers made the first airplane flight horizontal. Unlike Da Vinci's vertical vision, the dream of rising straight up remained. Inventors tried and failed with wings that flapped, spinning contraptions that wobbled, and machines that never left the ground. Flight was solved piece by piece and one experiment at a time. In 1907, French bicycle maker Paul Cornu finally lifted a rotorcraft a few feet off the earth. It was unstable, noisy, and barely controllable, but it proved spinning blades could raise a person. 3 decades later, Igor Sikorsky perfected the idea with a main rotor and a tail rotor for balance. His 1939 VS-300 became the first practical helicopter. So while Leonardo never left the ground, his sketch planted a seed. Centuries of trial and error finally let it take flight. And here's a practical question: would his aerial screw actually work with modern materials? The answer is yes. Students from the University of Maryland, USA, built a drone based on his design, and it lifted off. A machine sketched in the age of knights and castles finally flew in our own time. It is not far-fetched to say that Da Vinci's flying machine even inspired ideas that could one day help humans explore the skies of other planets. And here's a less-known detail: Leonardo also sketched ideas for diving suits, leather outfits with breathing tubes to the surface. Centuries before submarines, he was already imagining humans exploring beneath the waves. And that brings us to a man who made the ocean depths central to his imagination: Jules Verne. Jumping forward to the 19th century, we meet Jules Verne, the French novelist often called the father of science fiction. You've probably heard of Around the World in 80 Days, but 2 years earlier, in 1870, Verne published a story that would leave an even deeper mark: 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. At the heart of it was a machine that felt impossible at the time: the submarine Nautilus. In Verne's story, Captain Nemo's Nautilus was unlike anything the world had seen. It was sleek, electric-powered, and capable of roaming beneath the oceans for weeks at a time. Inside, it had luxurious rooms, a grand library, and even a pipe organ. To 19th century readers, this wasn't just fantasy, it was almost unimaginable. And that's because in reality submarines barely existed. During the American Civil War, the Confederate vessel Hunley was hand-cranked by sailors turning a propeller. It sank shortly after its first attack, killing its own crew. Submarines of the era were dangerous, cramped, and experimental at best. But Verne imagined something entirely different, a true underwater ship, self-powered, long-range, and independent, a vision that looks strikingly similar to the submarines we know today. So how did Verne know? Was it just wild imagination, or did he have a special talent for spotting clues? Verne was obsessed with the latest technology, devouring scientific journals and following every new invention. He took the seeds of real-world progress, primitive subs, new batteries, rumors of underwater travel, and pushed them to their logical extreme. Maybe it was his ability to connect the dots, to see where technology could go, and not just where it was. And here's the incredible part. Just a few decades later, engineers made it real. John Holland, often called the father of the modern submarine, built practical versions in the early 1900s, using a gasoline engine along with, you've guessed it, an electric motor. And then in 1954, the US Navy launched the very first nuclear-powered submarine. Its name, the USS Nautilus. So when that vessel slid into the water, it felt as if Verne's imagination had come full circle. Verne was a writer, not an engineer, but his work inspired generations of inventors, scientists, and even filmmakers. Georges Méliès, one of the cinema's pioneers, directly adapted Verne's story into some of the earliest science fiction films. And what's fascinating is that Verne wasn't content with just submarines. He also imagined moon landings decades before rockets existed. In one story, his astronauts launched from Florida, just like Apollo 11 a century later, but also returned by a splash. And if Verne looked to the stars and the seas, H.G. Wells dared to imagine a much darker future, a world forever changed by a single invention. Where Verne envisioned the ocean depths, another writer foresaw the most destructive weapon of the 20th century. In 1914, just as the First World War was beginning, British novelist H.G. Wells published The World Set Free. In it, he described bombs powered by atomic energy, devices that could devastate entire cities and leave behind radioactive wastelands. This was decades before scientists even understood nuclear chain reactions. Radioactivity had only recently been discovered by Marie Curie and others. The physics of splitting atoms was still unknown. Yet Wells not only imagined the science, but also the consequences. A world where such weapons could change the fate of nations.
And the force? It would take Yankee Stadium full of dynamite to equal the energy released in the complete fission of an amount of U-235 the size of a baseball.
But how did Wells know? How could a novelist with no formal training in physics so accurately predict the dawn of the nuclear age? Wells was fascinated by the latest scientific discoveries. He read widely, corresponded with scientists, and was always asking, what if? He took the faint glimmers of the new knowledge, radioactivity, the mysterious power inside the atom, and pushed them to their logical and terrifying conclusion. And here's the remarkable part. In 1932, a Hungarian physicist named Leo Szilard read Wells' novel. The story sparked something in his mind. The very next year, Szilard conceived the real scientific idea of a nuclear chain reaction. He later co-authored the famous letter to President Franklin Roosevelt that set the Manhattan Project into motion. When the first atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, the world saw in an instant the terrible reality of Wells' vision. Entire cities were reduced to ruins, tens of thousands of lives lost in moments, and a new era began. The nuclear age, where humanity's own inventions threatened its survival. So Wells didn't just predict the atomic bomb. His fiction influenced the very scientists who built it. What began as a story on a page rippled outward into history, blurring the line between imagination and reality. And what is interesting is that Wells wasn't only writing about destruction. His word brain was like an early version of the internet, a place where all human knowledge could be shared. And much like Jules Verne, he dreamed of traveling to the moon. In The First Man in the Moon, he described a barren surface, extreme heat and cold, and thin air that required special breathing suits. Details that turned out to be surprisingly close to what Apollo astronauts really faced. What these stories show is simple. Imagination isn't just fantasy, it's often the first step toward reality. Da Vinci, Verne, Wells, each saw the future before it existed. And this is only the beginning. In part 2, we'll explore inventions that went further, reaching into more recent times. Ideas once seen as science fiction that have since become part of everyday life, used by millions of people around the world. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.